The evening light was thinning when I first saw him standing on my porch. That hour just before the sun slips away, when everything feels softer but somehow more honest. Jonas held his hat the way a man does when he's rehearsed bad news the whole walk over. He didn't knock. He just stood there quiet as the old boards beneath him. And when I opened the screen door, he looked at me like he was remembering something he'd hoped he'd forgotten. Then he said it. That he'd found my mother's quilt. Folded. Waiting. In a barn no one had stepped inside for decades. I remember the air that evening. Warm but giving way to the cool of night. The kind of air that makes you feel like the world is holding its breath. The sky was split, gold on one side, blue on the other, like the day couldn't decide what it wanted to keep. Jonas didn't look older, not really. Just worn in the places life presses down hardest. Around the eyes, around the mouth, in the way he kept shifting his weight like he wasn't sure the porch would hold him. He'd been gone for years. Didn't send a letter. Didn't leave a message. Just slipped away from this little town the same way he stood on my porch. Quiet, careful, carrying something he didn't want to name. I stepped aside but he didn't come in. He stayed right where he was, fingers tightening around that hat brim. "Mara," he said, and my name sounded bruised on his tongue. "I saw something today." His eyes drifted past me into the house as if my mother might still be standing there in the hallway the way she used to. One hand on her hip, the other holding a piece of cloth she hadn't finished sewing. That's when he told me. The quilt. My mother's quilt. The one she worked on the night she died. The one that disappeared before sunrise. Something inside me went still, like a door shutting quietly. "Where?" I asked. Jonas swallowed hard. "In the barn. Down by Weaver's Creek." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. "That barn hasn't been open since I was a child," I whispered. "The roof's falling in. Nobody goes there." "I know," he said, voice dropping even lower. "But it was there, Mara. Folded on a chair like somebody meant to come back for it." A breeze pushed across the porch, lifting my hair. For a moment I smelled cedar, the same scent my mother used to rub into her sewing box. I moved closer to Jonas. "You're sure it was hers?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes traveled toward the road, toward the creek, like he was looking through time instead of distance. "I've only seen that pattern once," he said finally. "Not since before I ever met you." Cold slid down the back of my neck. "What does that mean?" I asked. Jonas didn't speak. Not yet. He just held that hat tighter, fingers whitening along the edges. The porch light flickered on above us, buzzing the way old bulbs do when they're fighting to stay alive. Its glow washed over Jonas's face, revealing something tired, and something guilty. "Mara," he said softly, "there are things about that night, things you were too young to know. Things nobody wanted to say out loud." The world around us felt smaller, pressed in by shadows and the noise of crickets waking in the grass. My heart thudded once, heavy. "You're talking like you know something I don't." Jonas nodded once, slowly. "When I saw that quilt this morning, all folded up like that, it didn't feel right. Felt like it was waiting. Like it wanted to be found." He shook his head, eyes dark. And I don't know why, but when I looked at it, I felt like I was standing inside someone else's memory. I stepped closer, searching his face for truth. "What happened, Jonas? Why come back now?" His breath left him in a slow exhale. "I guess I just kept thinking, maybe it's time. Maybe you should know what really happened." A chill spread through my chest. "What are you talking about?" He backed up a step, boots shifting on the porch. "You ever wonder why that quilt went missing the night she died?" Silence settled between us. Long, heavy, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Jonas finally placed the hat back on his head, like he needed something to hide behind. "I'll come by in the morning," he murmured. "If you want to see it, I'll take you." Then he turned and stepped off the porch. The gravel crunched beneath his feet, each step fading into dusk. I watched him disappear down the road, swallowed by the same shadows he'd brought with him. I stayed there long after he was gone, staring into the dark, remembering the quilt beneath my mother's fingers. Her quiet hum as she worked, the way the lantern light glowed against the fabric. And as the night gathered itself around the house, one thought kept circling in my mind. Why did Jonas look like he'd seen a ghost? And why did it feel like that ghost might be hers? The afternoon sun slanted through the dusty front windows as Lily stepped inside Auntie May's house again, notebook in hand, heart still restless from the night before. The air felt different today, heavier, almost expectant. As if the house knew something she didn't. She closed the door gently behind her, the wooden frame groaning like an old woman waking from a nap. Lily walked through the hallway, her fingertips grazing the faded wallpaper where the tiny blue flowers had almost disappeared with time. She moved slowly, listening, imagining May's footsteps drifting through these rooms long before she ever knew her. It felt strange, mourning someone she barely met, yet feeling pulled into her story as if she had always belonged to it. In the living room, dust floated lazily in golden beams of light, dancing as though stirred by invisible hands. Lily paused, watching the specks swirl and settle. It looked like time itself was hanging in the air, waiting for her to breathe it awake again. She knelt by the old wooden box she found yesterday. The lid was still half open, holding the last letter with May's handwriting, soft, looping, fragile. Lily lifted the letter carefully, feeling the paper tremble between her fingers. The ink had faded, the words softened by age, but she could still make them out. Childhood memories, secrets half told, names she didn't know. One name repeated more than once, though, softly written, almost shy on the page. Elijah. A name that didn't belong to any family member Lily knew of. A name spoken like a prayer, or a wound. She read those lines again, whispering them into the quiet room. He stayed when the world didn't. He stayed until he couldn't. The words made something twist inside her. Love, friend, or someone who left a scar. She set the letter down and stood, letting her eyes wander across the room. Framed photos on the mantel were coated in a thin gray layer. Faces she recognized only from stories and some she didn't recognize at all. May's eyes looked brighter in those old pictures, her smile fuller, as though she carried a happiness she never told anyone about. Lily stepped closer and blew gently on the frames. Dust scattered, caught the sunlight and glittered in the air like tiny falling stars. She picked up one photo, a young May leaning against a fence, hair tied back, sun on her cheek. Someone had cropped the picture long ago. The edge was torn, clean but deliberate. Someone had stood beside May in this photo. Someone had been cut out. The thought made the back of Lily's neck prickle. She set the photo down and drifted toward the kitchen. The floor creaked under her feet, bowls stacked neatly on the counter, everything still arranged as May left it. The house wasn't abandoned, it was waiting. Waiting for someone to pick up the pieces she left behind. As Lily ran her hand across the wooden table, she imagined May's hands doing the same, rolling dough, folding letters, smoothing fabric. She wondered what May thought about in these quiet moments. What weighed on her? What she wished she had said and to whom? The breeze from the half-open window brushed Lily's cheek. She closed her eyes. For a moment she felt something she couldn't explain, a presence, or maybe a memory that wasn't hers. Warmth like hands guiding hers. A whisper too soft to be real. Keep looking, Lily. Keep looking. She opened her eyes quickly. The room was empty. She stepped back into the living room, her pulse quickening. The dust in the beams had settled again, forming thin, shimmering layers on the wooden floor. Lily crouched and ran her finger through it, leaving a small trail. Something glittered beneath the dust. A tiny metal corner. Silver. She brushed the dust away and found a small locket, delicate and old. The hinge was slightly tarnished, but it glimmered faintly in the sun. Lily picked it up. It was warm, as if it had been waiting for her. She opened it gently. Inside was a miniature photograph of May in her younger years, smiling at someone just out of frame. And on the other side, etched so faintly she had to tilt it toward the light to read it. Random. 1972. Her breath caught. Elijah and May. The house seemed to exhale at the same moment she did, as if acknowledging the secret she'd uncovered. Lily turned the locket over, tracing its delicate edges. Why had May hidden it? Why had she tucked away letters, photographs, and memories like someone trying to bury a truth too heavy to carry? Lily sat on the floor, locket in her palm, surrounded by dust and sunlight. The house felt alive around her, the walls leaning in, the old floorboards humming with stories, the air thick with everything May never spoke out loud. Lily whispered to the empty room, "What were you trying to tell me, May?" A distant thump echoed from upstairs. Her head snapped up. She froze. Silence. Then another soft shift like a footstep. Or a memory falling into place. Lily stood slowly, the locket clutched tight in her hand and stared toward the staircase. Something was waiting for her on the second floor. And she didn't know whether it was the truth or another secret carefully folded into the house. But she knew one thing for certain. May didn't want her to stop now. The stairs groaned softly under Lily's feet as she climbed, each step releasing a faint breath of dust into the air. The house felt colder on the second floor, as if the sun hadn't touched this part of the home in years. Shadows stretched long across the hallway, lining the corridor like silent witnesses to whatever had once lived here. Lily's fingers grazed the banister, tracing the worn, smooth trail where Auntie May's hand must have traveled countless times. Halfway up, Lily paused. She could hear it again, that faint shifting sound. Not loud enough to be footsteps, not soft enough to be ignored. Something between the two. Something alive in the stillness. She swallowed and continued up. At the top of the stairs, the hallway opened into a quiet, narrow passage. 3 doors, all slightly ajar. The light from the windows fell in angled patches on the floor, illuminating dust that hung suspended like tiny spirits drifting through an unending afternoon. Lily stepped into the first room. It was May's sewing room. The scent of old fabric and cedar greeted her instantly. Bolts of faded cloth stood in neat rows on a shelf. Spools of thread sat quietly on the table, most covered in a fine layer of dust. But one spool, a deep red one, was clean. No dust at all. As if someone had picked it up recently. Lily's eyebrows pulled together. She touched the spool gently. It rolled slightly under her fingers, not stuck like the others. She lifted it and held it to the light. Why this one? She scanned the room. On the far table, under a square of dull cotton cloth, something created an uneven shape. Lily approached slowly, her breath catching in her throat. She lifted the cloth. A quilt square. Half finished, the edges frayed, the center stitched with incredible precision. Soft rose patterns intertwined with pale gold thread. The stitching was neat, careful. A kind of care that held emotion in every loop. But it wasn't the pattern that made Lily's breath hitch. It was the initials stitched in the lower corner. She felt the air drain out of her chest. The same initials from the locket downstairs. Elijah and May. This quilt piece, it wasn't just fabric. It was a story preserved in thread. She lifted it delicately. The fabric felt warm, as if touched recently. As if someone had been working on it even after May passed. But that wasn't possible. Unless May had been sewing it until her very last days. Working in this quiet room, carrying memories she never shared. Lily looked around again. The sewing machine sat untouched. The folded fabrics were still in neat stacks. But near the window, on the small wooden chair, there was a slight indentation. A fresh one. Lily walked to it and pressed her hand lightly against the seat. The wood was not warm, but it wasn't cold either. Not like the untouched furniture around it. Someone had sat here. Not long ago. Her heartbeat quickened as she turned toward the window. Through the glass, the late afternoon light spilled into the room, catching a faint shimmer on the floor near the chair. She knelt and picked it up. A gold thread. Thin. Tiny. She held it between her fingers. It didn't match any of the old spools on the shelf. Someone had brought it here. Her throat tightened with the sudden swirl of questions. Who? Why? What were they finishing? Or hiding? She turned her attention back to the quilt square. The stitching, though neat, changed slightly in the corner. At first Lily thought it was a mistake. But then she leaned closer. The thread dipped, curved, then crossed in an intricate loop. Not random. A pattern. A symbol. A hidden mark. She ran her finger lightly over it, feeling the raised thread. A tiny tremor passed through her, as if the memory stitched into the fabric traveled straight from May's hands into her own. She whispered, "What were you trying to say, May?" Her voice felt too loud in the quiet room. A soft creak sounded from the hallway. Lily froze. The door was still open, but now it seemed slightly wider than before, the shadows darker. She stepped back instinctively, clutching the quilt square to her chest. Something in the house felt suddenly awake, watching. She walked slowly toward the door, her breath tight, her footsteps soundless on the wooden floor. She peeked into the hallway. Nothing. Just the narrow corridor and the slow floating dust. But her body felt the shift. The house was no longer just holding its memories. It was guiding her deeper into them. She stepped into the hallway again and looked toward the last room at the end. The door was cracked open more than the others. The darkness behind it seemed thicker, heavier. like a room that held something unfinished. She took a slow breath. The quilt square still warm in her hand. May had stitched something into this fabric. Something personal, something she couldn't say aloud. Something Lily was meant to find. And whatever came next was waiting behind that last door. The room at the end of the hallway felt colder even before Lily stepped inside. The door resisted slightly when she pushed it, as though it hadn't been opened in a long while, or as though something behind it preferred to remain undisturbed. When it finally gave, a thin ribbon of light slid across the floor, illuminating motes of dust that moved like slow, drifting snowflakes. This room had once been a bedroom. She could tell by the shape of the space, the faint outline of where a bed frame once stood. Now it was nearly empty. Just a small wooden trunk against the wall, a chair with a cracked seat and a single picture frame face down on the windowsill. Lily stepped in carefully, her footsteps muted by the thick stillness. The air here carried a faint scent of old paper and lavender, the same scent May used to wear when Lily was a child. A memory brushed through her like a soft hand, and for a moment she felt May close, as though she had only just left the room. Her eyes drifted to the trunk. It was old, covered in scratches and a few worn patches where the lacquer had peeled away. The brass latch was tarnished, the wood dull with age. But something about it felt deliberate, placed there for a reason, left untouched for the right moment. Lily knelt beside it. When she lifted the lid, it released a small sigh of air, as if exhaling a story it had held in for far too long. Inside, the first thing she saw was a stack of papers tied with a faded blue ribbon. Beneath that, folded with meticulous care, were several quilt squares, each stitched with patterns she had never seen May use. Some were soft greens, some deep blues, and one had a tiny stitched bird perched on a branch. They looked older, or perhaps simply more intimate. But what caught Lily's attention wasn't the quilt pieces. It was the notebook lying at the bottom of the trunk. A small leather-bound journal, cracked at the edges, the kind that held secrets not meant for anyone else. She lifted it gently. The cover felt warm from the trunk's insulated air. The pages, when she opened it, were yellowed, soft at the corners. The first page contained a date from nearly 30 years before Lily was born. And one sentence, written in May's familiar cursive. "I begin this only because I can no longer carry the weight alone." Lily's chest tightened. She turned the page. The writing was steady but heavy, like every word May wrote cost her something. She read quietly. "He promised me he wouldn't come back. But I know promises don't hold men like him. So I've left what I can, stitched where I can, and prayed the rest might one day reach the hands meant to finish what I couldn't." A chill ran down Lily's spine. Who was she talking about? Elijah? Someone else? And what was she trying to finish? She kept reading, but half a page later the writing stopped abruptly. The rest of the journal was blank, page after page untouched. As if May had started to unburden herself, and then something had stopped her. Lily closed the journal slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. She placed it beside her and turned her attention to the picture frame on the windowsill. The glass was smeared with dust. She lifted the frame and wiped it clean with her sleeve. A photograph stared back at her. A young May, maybe in her 20s, standing beside a tall man with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. Lily had seen pictures of May's husband before, but this was not him. The man had one hand in his coat pocket, the other resting lightly on May's shoulder. Their closeness wasn't romantic but intimate, threaded with a kind of trust Lily didn't quite understand. At the bottom of the photo, faint but still visible, were 2 letters written in pencil. The same initials from the quilt. Elijah. Except May had never once spoken his name. Lily's stomach tightened as the questions multiplied. Why had May hidden all this? Why the quilt squares? Why the unfinished journal? And who was the man who kept appearing in these quiet, secret corners of her life? She turned back toward the trunk. A small envelope had been tucked beneath the fabrics, almost invisible unless you were searching. She pulled it out carefully. The front had a single line. "For when she is ready." She didn't need to wonder who she was. May had left this for her. Her heartbeat quickened as she slid her finger under the flap and lifted the seal. Inside was a small key. Brass, worn, but carved with a tiny floral pattern that matched the quilt square she had found earlier. Lily held it tightly in her palm, feeling the faint indent of the metal press into her skin. Whatever this key opened, May had believed she would need it. Someday. Maybe that day was now. She stood slowly, the room seeming to shift around her as though acknowledging her next step. The light from the window had dimmed as clouds drifted across the sun, casting long shadows along the floor. Lily took one last look at the photo, the journal, the key. Questions wrapped around her like threads tightening into a pattern she couldn't yet see. Why had May begun a story she never finished? What had she been trying to protect? And what truth waited quietly for Lily, unlocked and finally ready to be found? The morning had a dull, pewter-colored light to it, the kind that makes everything feel softer, quieter, as if the world is trying not to disturb a sleeping house. I sat on the porch steps with the quilt across my knees, tracing the dark blue square with my thumb. That patch felt heavier than the rest, like it carried its own story stitched beneath the pattern. Jonas stood a few feet away, pretending to look at the road, though his shoulders told me he wasn't really seeing anything. He held his hat the way a man does at a funeral, low, tight, like he didn't trust his hands to stay steady. "You said you recognized the fabric," I murmured, my voice almost lost to the morning wind. Jonas didn't answer at first. The silence stretched long between us, bending under its own weight. Finally he exhaled, slow and uneven. "I shouldn't have brought it up," he said. "Not unless you were ready." "Jonas," I whispered, "I'm asking you now." He turned toward me, his eyes lined with something old, something he'd been carrying far longer than I'd known. He walked over and sat on the step below mine, close enough for me to see the tension in his jaw. "That blue pattern," he began, tapping the square gently, "it belonged to a man who passed through town a long time ago. Summer before your mama died." I felt the air thin around us. "He didn't stay long," Jonas continued. "A month, maybe less. Folks didn't notice him much. He wasn't loud. Just quiet. Like someone trying not to leave footprints." I raised my eyes slowly. "Did Mama know him?" Jonas looked down at his hands. "More than she let on." The words landed like a stone in my chest, quiet but heavy. I waited, letting the silence do its work. In time he spoke again. "I saw them together once," he said softly. "Down by the creek. Late afternoon. Thought she was by herself, so I walked over with some peaches I'd picked. But then I heard voices. Soft. Not arguing, but something close." A small breeze lifted the quilt's corner, brushing it against my arm like a cold breath. "What did you hear?" I asked. Jonas swallowed hard. I couldn't make out the words. Just the tone. He sounded sorry. And she sounded tired. The kind of tired that sits in the bones. He paused, as though searching the memory for the parts he wished he could forget. "She held something in her hand," he said. "A handkerchief. Blue. Same pattern as this piece right here." My fingers froze over the square. "That patch," he added quietly, "it wasn't hers. It was his." A soft ringing filled my ears. Not a sound around me, but something inside, like an old bell struck for the first time in years. The quilt suddenly felt warmer across my knees, as though the story sewn into it was beginning to shift, revealing an edge I'd never noticed. "Why didn't Mama tell me?" I whispered. Jonas looked up then, and his expression held the kind of sorrow that doesn't ask to be forgiven. "Some chapters ain't easy to pass down," he said. "And some folks take their secrets with them, hoping the silence might protect the ones they love." I stared at the quilt, the patchwork colors blurring for a moment. "And you?" I asked softly. "Why didn't you tell me when I got older?" His mouth tightened, not in anger but in regret. "Because I thought it wasn't my place. I figured if she wanted you to know, she'd have left something behind. A letter, a sign, something." His voice dipped. Didn't expect the quilt to return. A faint ache curled through my chest. "You think this stranger meant something to her? More than just someone passing through?" Jonas hesitated, and in that hesitation, I heard the answer before he could speak it. "He carried himself like a man with history," Jonas said at last. "Not with the town. With her." He rubbed a hand over his face. "He never gave his full name. Just initials stitched in his coat." "What initials?" "Him. The same letters Aunt Lila refused to explain. The same letters hidden in the barn. The same letters that stared at me from the photograph." My fingers tightened around the edge of the quilt. "What did he want with her?" I asked. Jonas shook his head. "I don't know for certain. But the day he left, your mama walked to the creek alone and stayed there long after dark. Wouldn't talk to anyone. Not even your father." A hollow stillness settled over me as if the world had paused to hear what came next. He looked at me carefully, gently. Your mother, she was a good woman, Mara. Honest, steady, kind. But she had a past before she married. A life she didn't speak about much. You were too young to know. And by the time I thought you might understand, she was gone. My throat tightened, a small tremor in my voice. And this man, what happened to him? Jonas exhaled, shoulders sagging. Left town. No note. No address. Just disappeared like he never existed. He paused. But not before I saw him hand your mama that blue handkerchief. She folded it once, real slow, and tucked it near her heart. That's the last I ever saw of him, and of that fabric. I looked down at the patch again, seeing it now with new eyes. Not a square of cloth. Not just a piece of a quilt. But a fragment of a life Mama never spoke of. A thread leading somewhere she'd never let me follow. Jonas rose slowly, his boots scraping the wood. I'm sorry, Mara, he said quietly. I should have told you long ago. I shook my head. No, I murmured, my voice steadying. You told me now. He nodded once before stepping off the porch, leaving me in the pale morning light. The wind picked up, lifting the quilt ever so slightly, the blue square catching the sun in a way that made it glow. I touched it gently. A stranger with tired eyes. A handkerchief folded at the heart. A mother stitching a secret into fabric. A story beginning to unspool. And somewhere inside it, a truth that had waited longer than I realized. Waiting perhaps for this very moment. The creek was quieter than I remembered. Quieter than any place had a right to be that early in the day. The water moved in thin, glassy ribbons, brushing against the stones with a patience that made my chest ache. I stood at the edge, hands buried in the pockets of my coat, trying to steady the weight of everything Jonas had told me. The trees leaned over the water like old listeners, their branches bare enough to let the morning light slip through in pale streaks. I used to come here with Mama. She'd sit on the largest rock, the one shaped like a broken heart, and hum to herself while I threw pebbles into the stream. I hadn't let myself remember that in years. Now every memory felt brighter, sharper. Like the creek had been waiting to return them to me. I stepped closer to the stones, letting the cold air from the water lift goosebumps along my arms. Something about this place felt unsettled, as if the ground itself remembered footsteps. Footsteps that weren't mine. It was then I noticed it. A faint line through the mud, too narrow to be an animal track, too straight to be accidental. A trail. Barely visible but there. Winding away from the creek and toward the woods behind Weaver's barn. I crouched down and touched it with 2 fingers. The earth was soft, recently disturbed, the way it gets after someone has walked through before the sun dries everything out. Someone had been here. Recently. My heartbeat fluttered, light but insistent. I followed the trail, slow at first, then with growing certainty as the sun crept higher. The path cut through the brush, weaving between low branches and winter-tough grass. Halfway toward the barn, something caught the light. A thin thread tangled on a thorn. Blue. I felt the world narrow around me. The same blue as the patch on the quilt. The same blue Jonas said belonged to the stranger. I reached out and slipped the thread off the branch. It was soft and clean, not weathered or frayed. Fresh. The wind stirred behind me and a shadow stretched long over the ground. I turned quickly, startled, only to see Jonas standing a few steps back, his breath visible in the cold. You shouldn't be out here alone, he said quietly. His voice didn't sound reproachful, just tired. Tired in a way that made me wonder how long he'd been watching the trail too. I held out the thread. You see this? His eyes tightened just slightly. Yeah. I do. It matches the quilt, I said. He nodded once, slow. I know. Something unspoken hung heavy between us. Jonas stepped closer and looked down at the narrow trail through the brush. This path, he murmured. It wasn't here last week. How can you be sure? I walk this way most mornings. He glanced toward the trees. Checking traps. Clearing branches. I would have seen it. I studied his face. There was a quiet fear there. Not loud, not panicked, but the kind that gathers behind the eyes of someone who's already pieced together more than he wants to admit. You think someone's walking between the creek and the barn? I asked. He hesitated, then nodded. Why would they? I whispered. His mouth pressed into a thin line, as if he'd been asking himself that same question for days. Could be nothing, he said. Could be someone passing through. Kids. Hunters. The way he said it told me he didn't believe any of those options. I touched the blue thread again. It fluttered in my palm like a warning. There's more, Jonas said quietly. I turned to him. He pointed toward the barn. Or rather, toward the space just beyond it. 2 nights ago I saw a lantern light near the ridge. Didn't think much of it then. He paused. But now, with this, the thread in my hand suddenly felt heavier. Jonas, I said slowly, if someone is going to that barn, they're not just wandering. He didn't answer. Instead, we followed the trail the rest of the way in silence. When the barn finally came into view, it looked the same as it always had. Sagging beams, tilted roof, a structure leaning against time like an old man with a cane. Nothing about it seemed different. But the air around it felt changed. Tighter. Almost expectant. I stepped ahead of Jonas, my eyes fixed on the door. The wind nudged it gently, causing it to creak on its hinges. A shiver traveled through me that had nothing to do with the weather. At the threshold I bent down instinctively. Something had brushed against my boot. Another thread. Blue. Caught on the bottom edge of the door. I didn't even need to hold it to know it matched the first one. Jonas stepped beside me. That wasn't there yesterday. His voice carried a quiet kind of dread. I swallowed hard. The quilted home. The patch Mama didn't sew. The stranger Jonas never spoke about. The letters Aunt Lila refused to mention. The path leading right here. Every thread, literal or not, was pulling me toward this barn. What do you think happened? I asked, barely above a whisper. Jonas stared into the darkness inside the barn. I don't know, he said softly. But someone walked this path. Someone with blue thread on their clothes. Someone who knows this place. Or someone who knew her, I murmured. Jonas didn't answer. The silence between us felt like a door half opened. A truth standing just inside. Night settled over Weaver's barn the way dust settles on old shelves. Slow, patient, quietly claiming every corner. I held the lantern close to my chest as I walked, its small circle of light trembling across the ground. The rest of the world was swallowed in darkness, the kind that makes you feel like you're the only person left awake. The path to the barn felt different at night. Narrower. More uncertain. The trees along the way leaned in a little too close, their branches whispering against each other like they knew something I didn't. Even the air felt heavier, thick with the kind of stillness that presses against your ears. I reached the barn door and paused, listening. Nothing. Just the stretch of silence that comes after a decision you can't take back. I pushed the door open. Creaked, long, slow, as if complaining about being disturbed after so many years. My lantern light spilled into the space, brushing against the dust, the beams, the empty chair where the quilt had once sat. The shadows shifted like they were breathing. I stepped inside. The floor groaned beneath my boots, each sound echoing up into the rafters. The dust stirred in the lantern glow, floating like pale ghosts around me. Something about the air felt different than it had that morning. Warmer yet unsettled, as though someone had been here and left in a hurry. Then I smelled it. Faint. Barely there. Tobacco. But not the sweet kind some old men chew. This was sharper, more bitter. A scent that didn't belong to the barn or to anyone I knew in town. I took another careful breath, trying not to let my imagination catch fire. I'd never smelled tobacco here before. Jonas never smoked. Mama never allowed it near the house. Someone else had been inside. Recently. My lantern flickered as though it too felt the change in the air. I walked toward the center of the barn, each step measured, cautious. The wooden walls groaned with the cold night wind, their voices long and weary, as if they remembered every secret ever whispered within them. Something glinted near the chair. I walked closer, lowering the lantern until the light stretched across the floorboards. There, lying beside the leg of the chair, was a scrap of fabric. Dark blue. Fresh. I knelt down, my hand trembling before I even touched it. The fabric was soft, unweathered, not torn from age or rot. It looked as though it had been dropped or left, just moments before I arrived. The same pattern as the quilt's strange square. I held it between my fingers, the lantern light shimmering through the weave. It didn't feel like a clue. Felt like a message. The barn creaked again, louder this time. I rose slowly, turning toward the sound, my heart thudding. The shadows leaned long across the walls, stretching toward me in thin, reaching arms. For a moment I thought I saw something shift in the corner near the old grain barrels. Something small, like a movement made too quickly to catch. I stepped toward it. "Hello." My voice broke the silence, thin as thread. No answer. Just the soft sigh of wind slipping through the cracks in the boards. But the feeling that someone had been here, someone who stood in this room, breathed this same air, grew stronger with every heartbeat. The lantern swayed slightly in my hand. If someone had come to the barn after Jonas and I left earlier, why? And why leave the fabric? Why return at night when no one would see? I moved deeper into the barn, letting the lantern touch each shadow one by one. The tobacco scent came and went in the air, faint but certain, settling into the wood as though trying to blend in. And then near the far wall I saw something else. Footprints. Barely visible, pressed into the thin layer of dust. Not mine. Not Jonas's. Not old enough to be years or months old. Fresh. The steps led toward the back door, but the door was still latched with the rusted hook that always took effort to lift. Whoever made the footprints must have entered and exited through the front, same as me. But when I felt the slightest tremor run through my fingers, I took a step back, lantern held higher now. The barn felt full, not of people but of memory, of movement that lingered after its owner had gone. The air held a faint echo of presence, like someone had just stepped outside and would return if I waited long enough. A loose board creaked behind me. I spun around, breath catching in my throat, but it was only the wind slipping under the door. Something in me didn't believe it was the wind. The scrap of fabric weighed warm in my hand. Someone had been here. Someone who knew Mama. Someone who carried the same blue pattern in their clothes. Someone who walked the trail from the creek to the barn. Maybe someone who wasn't ready to be seen. I exhaled shakily and slipped the fabric into my coat pocket, feeling the weight of its story settle against my ribs. The lantern flames steadied, softening the shadows around me. I took one last look at the footprints, the chair, the lingering shape of the quilt that was no longer here. And then I stepped toward the door. As I opened it, the wind rushed in, brushing past me like a person leaving or arriving. I couldn't tell which. The night felt colder, sharper, as though the truth itself had shifted in the dark. I looked back once, letting the lantern linger on the empty, waiting space. Someone had been here. And they weren't done yet. The first thing I heard was the barn door settling behind me, a low groan that rolled across the dark like an old man waking from a long sleep. It was past midnight when I stepped back inside that place, lantern trembling in my hand, the cold laying itself across my shoulders like something intentional. The quilt lay exactly where I'd left it, on the hay bale near the wall, its faded blues and soft browns breathing quiet in the lantern glow. But tonight the air felt different. Heavier. Like the barn knew I was coming back for more than answers. I crouched beside it, brushing my fingers over the stitching, tracing the same pattern I'd traced 1,000 times as a child. My mother used to hum when she stitched, little half-melodies that drifted through the house like slow wind. For a moment, standing there in that still barn, it felt like her voice was somewhere just beyond hearing. Just a breath away. Then the lantern flickered. Not from the wind. Not from movement. From something else. Something that made the shadows stretch and pull at the corners of the room as if they were watching me. I turned slowly, expecting to see the barn empty the way it always was. But the emptiness didn't comfort me this time. It pressed too close like it had been waiting. I lifted the quilt, holding it up so the lantern light washed through the worn fabric. That's when I saw it, something I hadn't noticed before. A thread. Deep red. Buried near the edge of one of the squares. I tugged it gently, and the corner lifted just enough to reveal a small symbol stitched beneath the fold. A swirl. A curve. Almost like the beginning of a name. Or a warning. The moment I touched it, the lantern flared again, bright enough to wash the barn walls in gold. And that's when the memory hit me. I was 8 years old, standing in our kitchen while Mama talked to a man I'd never seen. His voice low. Hers lower. A quilt spread across the table between them. The same pattern. The same colors. And her hands covering that same stitched mark as if she didn't want him to see it. I hadn't thought about that memory in years. Maybe I'd convinced myself it wasn't real. But here, with the mark glowing under lantern light, it felt sharp as a splinter in my mind. Something shifted behind me. Not loud. Not threatening. Just a shuffle. hay moving under a footstep. I swallowed hard and turned, lantern raised, expecting maybe a stray animal, or worse, my imagination turning circles in the dark. But it wasn't that. It was the feeling you get when somebody's breath touches the back of your neck, but when you spin around no one's there. The barn was still. Too still. As if holding itself in. I backed toward the quilt again, clutching it closer, the stitched symbol brushing against my wrist. My mother had made this with her own hands. Every square. Every corner. Every secret. And someone else had seen it before. Someone who shouldn't have. The wind pushed softly against the boards outside, but inside the barn nothing moved. Nothing dared. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of the memory still unraveling inside me. Who was that man? Why had Mama hidden the mark? And why, after all these years, was the same symbol staring back at me now? The lantern dimmed again, slipping back into its quiet glow. And the barn returned to silence. But my heart didn't. Because I knew without anyone telling me, without the wind whispering it through the cracks, that this wasn't just a forgotten piece of cloth. This quilt carried something my mother never spoke about. Something she never meant for me to find. And out there somewhere, maybe in this town, maybe closer than I realized, was the man who'd seen it first. The one who knew what that symbol meant. The one who remembered. The floorboards were colder than I expected. Old wood usually holds the day's warmth, but that night it felt like the house itself had pulled its heat inward, bracing for something it didn't want to give up. I knelt beside the hallway wall, the lantern casting a thin ribbon of gold across the floor. The quilt lay folded beside me like a quiet witness, its corners trembling each time my breath touched it. That strange symbol, half curve, half stroke, still lived beneath the stitching, and now it felt like it was pointing me somewhere. Not with sound. Not with instinct. With memory. A memory I didn't even realize I'd held. I pressed my hand against the board just beneath where Mama used to hang her apron. The wood dipped ever so slightly, the way it does when something has been lifted too many times. A secret handled more than a surface should allow. I slipped my fingertips into the seam and gently pulled. At first it resisted. But then it gave, slowly, almost reluctantly, rising the way a sigh rises from someone who's been holding a truth too long. Inside, dust curled upward in a small cloud, dancing in the light like ash. Beneath it lay a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a thin strip of pale blue cloth. A strip that matched the quilt exactly. My breath caught in my throat. The edges of the letters were worn, like they'd been read and reread, folded and unfolded, held close by hands too tired to keep letting go. I lifted the bundle carefully, feeling the weight, light but dense with something more than paper. Something lived. Something remembered. The top envelope had a name written across it, but time had rubbed the ink down until only a few letters remained. An A, a slanted R, and the faint tail of something that might have been an M. Or an E. My chest tightened. It almost spelled my mother's name. And almost spelled someone else's. I untied the cloth, letting the strip fall across my knee like a river of faded sky. The letters inside were brittle, their folds sharp enough to cut if handled too quickly. I opened the first one with the kind of caution usually reserved for lifting a sleeping child. The handwriting was rough, uneven, like someone trying to steady their hands between fear and urgency. The ink had bled in places, blurring words into soft shadows, but I could still make out pieces. You said the quilt would be the sign. Nobody must know. If he comes back. The barn. The girl. My stomach dropped. The girl. Me. I read the lines again, slower this time, as though my eyes needed to relearn the shape of everything I thought I understood. The barn. The quilt. A man. A warning. And my mother. Caught somewhere between love and danger, stitching secrets into cloth because that was the only language she could trust. Another envelope lay underneath, thicker, heavier. I reached for it, but before I could slide it open, a soft creak traveled through the old hallway behind me. The kind of creak that comes when a foot presses down on a board that hasn't been touched in years. I froze. The lantern flames stilled. The air tightened. The house listened. I didn't turn right away. I let the silence settle, waiting to hear the sound again, waiting to decide whether it was memory, or something else standing there in the dark with me. But nothing followed. Just quiet. Only then did I look over my shoulder. Slow, measured, the way you look when you're not sure you want to see what's waiting. No shape. No shadow. just the hallway swallowing its own darkness. I exhaled shakily and turned back to the letters, clutching them tighter, feeling how fragile and yet how heavy they were. These weren't just messages. They were pieces of a truth my mother hid beneath the floorboards because she must have known. One day, I'd come searching. One day the past would knock. One day the markings on the quilt would no longer be enough to cover what was coming. The last envelope remained unopened, thicker than the rest, a faint stain marking its corner. I slid my thumb beneath the flap but hesitated. Because something in me knew, whatever was inside would change everything I thought I knew about her, about the barn, about the man who claimed he'd seen the quilt before. And maybe, just maybe, about why she'd kept her silence all those years. I held the letter against the lantern light, heart pounding slow and deep, and wondered, was I finally ready to read the truth she never meant for me to find? The moment I stepped into Aunt Lila's kitchen, I knew this conversation would be different. The air smelled faintly of tea and old wood, but beneath it something hung, like the weight of secrets that had been simmering for decades. Lila sat at the table, her hands trembling slightly as she poured, never looking up. The teacup wavered in her grasp, delicate porcelain pressed to knuckles white with tension. I set the letters down carefully between us. The quilt sat folded at my side, a quiet witness to the truth I was about to demand. Lila's eyes finally met mine and I saw it, years of worry, of memory deferred, flickering behind her pupils like candlelight. I found them, I said softly, almost afraid to speak. The letters, everything in the barn. Why didn't anyone tell me about him? About her? My fingers fidgeted with the edge of the quilt, tracing the dark blue patch as if it might answer me. Her hands shook harder. She pressed them to the table, gripping the porcelain until the edges ached. The silence stretched, filling the space between us with years of unspoken words. Finally she exhaled. A slow, measured sound that carried the weight of decades. Because some things, she whispered, are meant to protect, not to hurt. Your mother, she loved before she met your father. And that love, it returned unexpectedly. The air shifted around me, cold and fragile, like the first frost before dawn. Returned? I asked, my voice barely audible. Him. Lila nodded, looking down at the table. The tremor in her hand seemed to mirror a tremor in her heart. Yes. He came back in a way no one expected. Your mother tried to stitch her life together to reconcile the past with the present. That quilt, each square, each stitch, was her attempt to hold both worlds without letting the past unravel everything she loved now. I traced the blue patch with my thumb. So, the quilt was more than fabric. It was her story. A tear slipped down Lila's cheek, but she didn't move to wipe it away. Yes. It was her confession, her hope, her apology, all in one. She wanted you to know one day, but she didn't know how to make you ready. And I didn't want to open old wounds before you were ready to see. I swallowed, the letters and the quilt heavy in my lap, their weight no longer just material. Jonas. He said he didn't tell me because he thought it wasn't his place. Lila looked up at me then, her eyes soft but sharp. He was trying to protect you too. Everyone around her was guarding pieces of her story. It wasn't malice, just love. And fear. Fear that the truth would break more than it would heal. I sat back, breathing slowly, trying to absorb everything at once. My mother had lived a life I never knew. A life threaded into quiet afternoons, blue handkerchiefs, men who came and went, and quilts that held pieces of her heart. And all this time we'd kept it buried, thinking silence was safer than revelation. Was the quilt her final message to me? I asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. Yes, Lila said, her voice barely a whisper. Every stitch was her voice. Every patch a memory she wanted you to touch, understand, someday. She never finished it because she didn't have time. But she left it in a place you would find it when you were ready. I looked down at the quilt again. The dark blue patch glowed in the late afternoon light, small but unmistakable. My fingers traced it, and for the first time I felt something like understanding, like the warmth wasn't just the fabric but the story it carried. Lila reached across the table, her hand brushing mine, a quiet apology, a gentle offering. Sometimes, she said, we inherit more than names or objects. Sometimes we inherit the stories that were too heavy for those who came before us. And it's up to us to hold them without letting them break us. I nodded, swallowing back a lump in my throat. I think I understand now. She wanted me to finish it. Not just the quilt but the story itself. To hold it, to know it. Yes, Lila said softly. And to forgive. Not them. Not anyone. Just, to forgive that life doesn't always give us everything we want. And that sometimes, love isn't enough to make the world neat and safe. But it is enough to leave something behind. The room held its breath, the tea cooling, the shadows growing longer across the floor. Jonas remained quietly at the edge of the kitchen, a silent companion to the revelation, his hands folded, eyes attentive. He hadn't needed to say anything. The silence itself carried the acknowledgement of years lost, of truths finally allowed to exist. I lifted the quilt into my lap, fingers tracing the edges, the dark blue square lying like a pulse against the faded patchwork. And for the first time I felt it, my mother's voice threading through the fabric, reaching across years and absence, whispering the truth she had never spoken aloud. The story wasn't just hers anymore. It was mine. And with it came a weight, yes, but also a warmth I hadn't expected. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, soft against the window, carrying a faint memory of the creak, of laughter long past, and of footsteps that had once walked this world without me. And for the first time I didn't feel lost. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The afternoon sunlight poured softly through the curtains, painting the room in shades of gold and amber. I sat at the old wooden table, the quilt spread across my lap, its weight familiar and strange all at once. Each patch felt like a finger pressed into the past, Mama's hands in the lantern light, the dark blue square stitched with a story I was only now beginning to understand. I picked up a needle and thread the same color as the mysterious square. My fingers hovered over the fabric, feeling the texture, the memory stitched into it. Slowly, deliberately I began to sew. Each pull of the thread through the cloth was careful, measured, as though I were stitching not just fabric but time itself, completing what my mother had started, finishing a story paused decades ago. Jonas sat quietly beside me, his presence steady but unobtrusive. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The barn, the letters, the man with the tired eyes, they all lingered in the air between us, held softly in the warmth of the room. I could feel it. The quilt wasn't just a relic. It was a map of a life I'd never known, a story threaded with love, secrecy, and hope. The dark blue patch now lay perfectly aligned, its edges smoothed, sewn into the quilt as though it had always belonged there. I traced the stitching with my fingertips, feeling the warmth that wasn't from my hands or the sun, but from understanding. The understanding that my mother's story wasn't simple, wasn't neat, and wasn't just hers alone. Jonas finally spoke, voice low and careful. "It looks whole now." I nodded, breathing slowly. "Not just whole," I said. "Alive. It feels alive." He glanced at the quilt, then out the window where the evening light softened the edges of the world. "I didn't know if you'd ever want to finish it," he admitted. "I didn't know if the past was something you'd want to touch." "I did," I whispered. "Because it's mine too. All of it. The parts Mama shared, and the parts she couldn't. This quilt. It's how I finally understand her." I folded it gently over my lap, letting the weight of it settle. Every square, every stitch, every thread seemed to hum quietly, carrying fragments of memory and love, of longing and fear. I realized then that the quilt was not just a collection of fabric. It was the bridge between what was lost and what I could now carry forward. The room grew quieter, the soft hum of the evening stretching through the walls. Jonas reached over, placing his hand near mine on the table but not on the quilt. Just near it. A gesture of company, not ownership, of quiet acknowledgement. I felt a small, steady warmth in that presence. A shared recognition that some truths are meant to be held gently. I pressed my palm lightly against the quilt, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to breathe fully. My mother's life, with its hidden loves, its secrets, and its quiet bravery, rested in my hands now. I was part of it. I was entrusted with it. And somehow that trust made the past feel softer, less sharp, less like a loss and more like a story I could carry forward. Outside, the wind shifted through the trees, brushing against the house with the same whispering patience of Weaver's Creek. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky a deep, tender pink. Shadows stretched across the floorboards, but they no longer seemed threatening. They felt like the passage of time itself, gentle and inevitable. I folded the quilt slowly, the dark blue square catching the fading light, glowing faintly as if acknowledging the work I'd done. Jonas didn't speak. He just watched, and I knew he understood that this moment wasn't about explanation, apology, or revelation. It was about presence. About holding the threads of the past without being overwhelmed by them. And as I tucked the quilt carefully onto the back of the chair, a small, quiet question lingered in my mind, as persistent as the hum of the evening. What other truths do we inherit quietly without ever knowing? And how long does it take before we are ready to understand them? I leaned back in my chair, letting the light soften over my shoulders. The quilt lay there complete. But its story was far from over. It was now mine to carry, stitch by stitch, memory by memory. A living testament to a mother I had loved, a life I had never fully known, and a past that had quietly waited for me to arrive. The room settled around me. The day drew to a gentle close. And for the first time, I felt at peace with what had been hidden, what had been revealed, and what I would carry forward into the quiet years ahead.